So if you've seen my TEDx talk, you may know that the thing that really led me to compassion-focused therapy was my own kind of historical struggles with anger and irritability. And I've never been someone who had explosive rage and that created problems at my job, or in blowing up my relationships and things like this. But about 15 years ago or so, when my son came along, I became aware that I was modeling irritable and angry behaviors for him. The things that I'd struggled with really my whole life, that I didn't want him to have to struggle with. I didn't want to pass those struggles along to him by modeling them for him. And at that point, it just so happened that I had been reading a book about the life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and I had seen some things in that book that that really suggested to me that might be something about the Tibetan Buddhist practice might be helpful in my own struggles with anger. So I sort of really threw myself into intensive Tibetan Buddhist practice for about 3 years, and spent many hours meditating and being a part of a Buddhist Sangha and going to retreats and doing lots of different practices and things like this. And after about 3 years, when I kind of reflected back on what had happened in my life and the changes I'd seen in me as a result of that practice, a couple things became clear. The first was that my life had been transformed in exactly the ways that I had hoped it would, and in a lot of ways that I couldn't even imagine that it would. I couldn't have anticipated, but I was much better at working with my anger. I felt like I was doing a better job as a father and as a husband and as a teacher and the different roles in my life. And the second observation I made was that when I kind of went over all the different practices and the different things I had done in the context of the Buddhist practice, it was really the compassion practices that stood out to me as being really transformative. Being able to shift my relationship to myself and to other people in ways that were really infused with this willingness to observe the difficulty and the suffering and to stay with that, and to cultivate the real desire to work with them, to help, rather than, for example, when anger would show up in me, rather than to criticize myself for it or attack or feel ashamed of it, to say, oh, wow, that's really tough. What can I do? And so I got to a point where I started thinking, this compassion stuff is so helpful. It's been so helpful for me. I really want to find a way to bring that in the service of helping my clients. Now, I'm no great scientist, but I'm enough of a scientist to be uncomfortable with sort of reaching into a religion, into a spiritual domain, and plucking out a practice or a set of practices and then plopping it down in the therapy room. That didn't feel really comfortable for me. And so at that point, I started looking at the psychological literature and things like that, because I'm thinking, I can't have been the only person ever who thought about applying compassion or bringing compassion into the therapy room. And at that point, there really wasn't much out there yet. There were, Kristen Neff had published her measure and was publishing things, but her model wasn't a model of therapy. It was a model of just training general population samples in self-compassion. But in going through my research, I stumbled across the work of Paul Gilbert. And Paul Gilbert is the developer, obviously, of compassion-focused therapy. And I reached out to Paul and said, actually, I was initially wondering if he had a measure of compassion, because if you want to stimulate research in psychology, one of the things you can do is create a measure. And once people can measure it, they tend to research it more. And I got a hold of Paul, and he said, well, I don't actually have a measure of compassion. We have one now. He's developed one since. But what I do have is this model called compassion-focused therapy. And I'm doing a training in a couple months. And if you'd like, you can come over and come to the training and learn about it. So I did that. And when I got there to Darby to learn about CFT, it was everything that I had been looking for, right? Paul had a therapy that was focused on really bringing compassion into the therapy room, but it wasn't based in intuition or spiritual practice, although both of those things are important. It was based in science. It was based in a really nuanced understanding of the human condition and how we got that way, how we evolved to be this way, and how our brains work in ways that can be really tricky and hard to handle, in ways that are completely not our fault. We didn't choose them, we didn't design them, but they can create great difficulties with this, particularly in the way our evolved brains match up with modern life in tricky ways. So that's how I found CFT.